Welcome back to the final round of the debate show. During the break, we flipped a coin to determine which team would go first with the final debate. The final debate is whether it was right to spend public money on Baroness Thatcher's funeral. And I think we're kicking off with yourself and Team A.
Yes. Thatcher, the milk snatcher. Thatcher, whose funeral cost 3.6 million of the public's money. That's 3.6 million to present a false unity, saying that she united the country when actually she was the most dividing Prime Minister we've probably ever had. 3.6 million to hijack an old woman's funeral, to make it a political rally, to say this is why we are the best, because of this woman. 3.6 million in a country that already owes 1.4 trillion. How can you justify 3.6 million when we're already in so much debt just to get a political point across? 3.6 million, when if you look at previous Prime Ministers who were considered great, Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee spring to mind. Attlee's funeral was famously low-key, very cheap. I'm pretty sure it was a private funeral as well. Churchill got a state funeral that cost 2,000, adjust for inflation, that's 33,000. 3.6 million cannot be justified, especially when it's on the taxpayers' money. The milk snatcher strikes again.
Well, we completely disagree. Firstly, she was the first female Prime Minister that this country has had. Therefore, surely she was worth a proper state funeral. Secondly, we do this for all Prime Ministers. Thirdly, this is the 100th anniversary of the death of Emily Dickerson. It's a very important time for us and for particularly for women and women's suffrage. Therefore, the fact that Margaret Thatcher, elderly lady, I mean, it's the time to mark the passing of a woman who was highly influential, a highly influential international figure. Also, the option, we are a democracy, and the option was organised via social media for people to protest and turn their back if they disagreed. It was an absolute golden opportunity to show democracy in action. And whether you agree with what she did or not, she had a tremendous influence worldwide. And she was somebody who was a larger-than-life figure. And therefore, we agree that there should have been a state funeral.
I think to kind of mention Emily Dickerson, the fact that she's such a great leader for women, I think she did a lot to kind of go against that. All the things that we fought for, she wasn't a feminist icon, far from it. I feel that she kind of set everything back quite far, all that progress that was made. I think as a feminist, that's incredibly insulting to kind of put her in that same domain. Secondly, I think your point about social media and democracy and being able to kind of have an active voice against this. Plenty of people were protesting against the fact that she had a state funeral and everything but name. What was done about it? Nothing. Our voices were unheard, and we were just kind of put to the sideline. These were the protesters, just around the corner. There was also tons spent on policing against these protesters. Actually, freedom of speech, we were kind of, sidelined and almost made to look like the bad guys in all of this. Our voices weren't heard. Our voices were kind of almost demonised. So, yeah, those are 2 points I'd pick up on.
If Margaret Thatcher had an ordinary family funeral, she wouldn't have been able to. It would have been all over the Twitter sphere, the blogger sphere. Everybody would have known where she was being buried. So that would have happened organically. Without policing, it would have been an absolute nightmare. It needed to be organised.
I think a private funeral would be far more respectable for her in the long run, because the amount of protests that turned up at that state funeral, I'm pretty sure her family didn't want that. I'd say a private funeral would have been a better way to go.
There's a difference between organisation and a show. What Thatcher's funeral was a show. It was a show put on by the government to say, look, this is Thatcher, this is how amazing she was, and this is how amazing we are. It wasn't about protecting her funeral, and it wasn't about paying her respect. It was about paying her respect in a more propaganda-ish way. It wasn't about showing her actual respect, it was about showing her respect in a way to make themselves look good.
We don't just talk about Thatcher, we talk about the Thatcher era. So we talk about a slice of time, a period of time, a dynasty, a sort of an epoch, if you like. Therefore, we were not just marking Margaret Thatcher, we were marking Thatcherite policies and a way of being that was a particular parliamentary series of parliamentary laws, parliamentary ways of being, and a particular political system, and which was particularly marked with a dialogue with the unions, and particularly marked by a change of our industrial framework and our industrial sphere and heritage.
Well, I think that the point you make is absolutely correct, that her period in office was a period of hegemonic change, but I don't think it's anything to be celebrated. We are now living with the consequences of Thatcherism, which actually started in 2008 with the collapse of the financial services industry and the banks. And if you take a less London-centric view, I would argue, great swathes of this country have been devastated by the harshness and by frankly, the economic stupidity of Thatcherism. The neglect of industry in this country, when we had an opportunity with North Sea oil to retool, to reinvest, to reinvent British industry, was an absolute catastrophe. Instead of celebrating this woman, I think we should actually be sort of critiquing her and actually criticising what happened during that era. It was absolutely catastrophic for millions and millions of families up and down this country.
That's why we needed somebody who was very strong, very, very decisive, who perhaps people thought wouldn't listen to other people's points of view, but we needed a strong hand at that time. Otherwise, things might have fallen apart.
Well, I think that the myth of what happened during the 1970s has been promulgated by the Thatcherites, by the Conservatives. To be honest, aided and abetted by certain parts of the Labour Party as well, who I believe connived at this what happened in the 1980s by not actually getting themselves together in order to oppose what actually happened.
And Stephen, would you take the argument that some have advanced that actually Tony Blair and those years of New Labour were in some sense a very clever extension of Thatcherism that he actually secured?
I would say that Blair was an extension of Thatcher. I don't think it was particularly clever. I think that the New Labour settlement was actually just clearing up the mess rather than challenging the neoliberal position that Thatcher embodied.
So if we come to the core point of the debate, which is, would you put your hand in your wallet or your purse and contribute money for the state funeral of Baroness Thatcher, should it have been a choice? Some could. Chris, you've stayed silent so far. Would you be happy to pay for a state funeral of somebody who has this status?
I believe so, actually. Thatcher was a great woman. She was, hey, you can laugh, that's your opinion, don't mind. But she was amazing. She went to heights that no other woman has achieved yet. And you can say that she wasn't a feminist, but to many, she was quite the pinnacle of the political powerhouse. She was a powerhouse.
So for you,
she was the Iron Lady.
Would you contribute?
Yes, I would definitely.
Indeed. I mean, the impact she had, I think, warrants, negative or positive, the impact she had, I believe, warrants a state funeral. A cost, perhaps, is something I don't potentially agree on at the exact sort of amount, but I do believe that people needed to be able to be given the chance to publicly express how they felt, positive, negative, whatever. It needed to be a state funeral. I can't see any other way around. A private funeral, the people paying their respects would have done so in their own household. Any other member of public at a private event would have been there simply just to protest and cause huge amounts of disrespect to the woman.
You see it as like yet another event. It was almost a string of pearls with the Olympics, the Jubilee, Margaret Thatcher's funeral. It was yet another event where we can show pomp, circumstance, and what we do well. Callously, it probably pulled a lot of tourists.
Well, that's because we don't have any industry, and that's the fault of Thatcher. Sorry.
I was about to say, I dare say showing what we do well, protesting and complaining about things, sure, but I dare say it's nothing compared to the Olympics and the Jubilee, which was showing the country, look, this is what we can do well. If the rest of the world turned their attention to England during Thatcher's funeral, all they would have seen was us spending loads of money on an old woman's funeral and loads of people going, we don't like this.
I don't know loads of people. There was it's not just the United Kingdom that she affected. America, they've unbelievably positive about Margaret Thatcher.
Well, let them pay.
I disagree.
I would ask the question. Lizzie said that we've had state funerals for other prime ministers other than Winston Churchill. Well, of course we haven't. I think everybody would agree that Churchill was an extraordinary figure during the Second World War. Even my grandparents and my parents, who didn't particularly like Winston Churchill, thought that he was an amazing and unifying figure during the war. And that was absolutely clear that his rhetoric did actually voice something about the British people, the whole of the British people, that brought people together. I don't think you can say that about Margaret Thatcher. The real question, actually, is if we're going to have a state funeral or a quasi-state funeral for Margaret Thatcher, are we going to have quasi-state funerals for all of our prime ministers from now on? Because if you make the argument that Thatcher deserved it, then I think you can make exactly the same argument for John Major, for Tony Blair, for Gordon Brown, and even for David Cameron. Now,
And the smaller state funeral for Nick Clegg.
Just a side one, the side, yeah.
But this issue about, I take your point, was it a real state funeral or a quasi-state funeral? But marking time, I mean, you mentioned the funeral of Winston Churchill. At the time, yes, I'm old enough to remember, there was a strong voice that said, it's the end of an era. That funeral is marking the end of an era. Well, of course, it didn't. It marked maybe one era, but actually we think about what happened in Britain and the world since the mid-1960s. Huge amount of energetic, exciting, interesting, intriguing things. The world went on. We now have the death of Margaret Thatcher. Is that really just marking another act in a series of acts in the history of this country? In other words, it's not the end of anything, but it's a transition point to how we might become in the future.
I really think we are in a transition. We're in a transition from a sort of industrial age to a post-industrial age. We're looking at digital futures. We're looking at new forms of industry. We're looking at all sorts of industry which is not heavy lumps of metal necessarily. It's rapid prototyping. It's cognitive thinking, and it's sort of artifacts that are created in the mind, transmitted digitally and created somewhere else. This is a completely different kind of productivity, and I really think she saw it. She saw that there had to be change, and at that time, change is painful. The minds had to close.
Okay, at this point we have to make a decision, which I have to make, but I'm going to very quickly ask your team, how do you think they did in this debate? Were they good?
Quite well.
And how did you think? How did you think they did?
I think I really enjoyed them. You guys were good. Yeah.
You know, there's a greater vehemence in your voice. So I'm going to actually say the prize goes to this team because that way you said. But the prize is given not by me, but consensually by a whole group of people who hopefully have enjoyed this time in this kind of debate. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. So, thank you very much if you tuned in. And remember, polemic is great, but maybe debate is even better. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Two claps.
Two lonely claps.
Yeah. Echoing through the building.